Good evening, everyone. My name is Manish Rasuria, and I'm the co-chair of the university's LGBT Forum. It's a great honour to announce this event because this is our first time we've actually collaborated with the Museum Studies department. It is something that's never happened before, and it's also one of the series of events that marks 20 years of the establishment of the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries. So without further ado, let's talk to
Thank you. Thanks, Manish. And welcome everybody. It's brilliant to see you all here this evening, to have such a good turnout. We're really thrilled. We're going to begin. I'm going to give a short introduction and then hand over to EJ Scott, our main speaker for this evening, and then there'll be some time for questions and any discussion at the end. So the title for this session comes from a chapter I published in a book a couple of years ago called Museums and the Transgender Tipping Point, and it took inspiration from this headline on the cover of Time magazine in 2014, which made a claim that recent years had marked a tipping point in trans equality, characterised by increasing public awareness and improving political and legal recognition of transgender rights. At the same time, the article drew attention to the ongoing challenges many trans people experience, in particular the prejudice and discrimination that can, for some, pervade every aspect of daily life. So over the last couple of years since that chapter was published, we've seen a deeply worrying trend in many parts of mainstream media here in the UK and elsewhere. The enduring presence of derisive caricatures and stereotypes, misleading, poorly researched news articles that fuel negative and sometimes hysterical attitudes towards trans people. And we're here tonight to explore what part museums might play in all of that, in tackling all of that. At a time when many trans people find their basic human rights routinely violated and withheld, what museums do or don't say about gender diversity might seem largely inconsequential. But I want to argue that museums should be much more open to presenting trans-inclusive narratives and much more ambitious in thinking about their capacity to foster respect and dignity for trans people. And my arguments grow out of research carried out by our Research Centre for Museums and Galleries here, a project which began back in 2008, 9 and 10, when RCMG was commissioned by the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow to explore the impact of their social justice programme. We interviewed trans community members, artists and activists who had worked collaboratively with GOMA, the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow, on a series of exhibitions and events. And we were interested in understanding why those trans individuals had got involved, why they thought arts and culture would be a productive arena in which to collaborate and engage. And the people we spoke with were unanimous in their view that negative depictions in the media played a huge part in shaping public opinion and behaviour. And on the basis of this, we carried out further research to explore what particular role museums might play. This was the exhibition, it was called Shout, at the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow that we were involved in. And as I said, on the basis of that research, we identified particular things that we felt museums could do. Undoubtedly, museums can give visibility to transgender lives that may be relatively poorly understood by the public at large. This image comes from an exhibition, April Ashley, Portrait of a Lady. It was an exhibition which ran at the Museum of Liverpool for 2 years, from 2013 to 2015, and it stands out as a still rare example of a major visible museum project that presented a rich and nuanced and substantive exploration of transgender lived experience. In terms of visibility, the exhibition occupied a really prominent position, so very often we find projects like this occupy really marginal spaces that are easily missed. In Liverpool, it was in a central location overlooking the atrium and it lasted for 2 years because of public interest and response, and it meant that the nearly 1 million visitors during that period couldn't fail to see it and engage with it. The Museum of Transology, which you'll hear about very shortly, has also achieved extraordinary visibility, and I'll let EJ tell you more about that in just a moment. The other important thing museums can do is provide a space within that broader mediascape for self-definition by trans communities. And many of the people we interviewed shared their frustrations at the lack of control trans people themselves had on portrayals that appeared in the press, on television and in film. And we explored how museums, with their turn towards more participatory and collaborative ways of working, potentially offered settings where trans people could be in control of the way their lives were presented. Greater control means that different, more authentic, respectful, empathetic kinds of portrayals can appear. So in place of the toxic caricatures that have very often been created by the media, museums could create these spaces for people to author, to narrate in very, very different terms, for trans people on their own terms. But these progressive representations do remain unusual in museums, and I've just got a few examples before I hand over to EJ. This image, an artwork, comes from an amazing exhibition coming out, which was curated out of National Museums of Liverpool and toured to Birmingham in 2017 and 18, featuring a substantive body of work that explored gender diversity and expression. In 2014, the Welcome Collection invited a group of young transgender people from leading trans awareness organisation Gendered Intelligence, and invited the young people to respond to themes within one of its exhibitions. The young people themselves, they were aged 13 to 19, and they created the Transvengers, a webcomic that featured a variety of transgender characters and invited public support for those characters' attempts to encourage awareness and support around gender diversity. My last example, another inspiring example further afield, can be seen in this exhibition called Mimi's Family, and it was particularly interesting, I think, because it was an exhibition at the Children's Museum in Boston in the United States in 2015. And to create that exhibition, photographer Matthew Clowney and exhibition designer Margaret Middleton worked closely with Erica Tobias, called Mimi by her grandchildren, a transgender grandparent and her family, to tell their story, but in a way that was purposely designed to build support for transgender respect and equality. What I think was especially interesting as well was the very socially purposeful use of those powerful photographs that offered not only a progressive and empowering expression of transgender identity, but also broke new ground in opening up conversations amongst children and families around gender diversity in a mainstream public space. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to EJ to tell you about the most significant field in this development in this field, the Museum of Transology, which, as you'll see, is one of the most compelling and powerful museum experiences I've had the pleasure to see. So over to you.
No pressure, yeah. So I will be your misrepresented hysterical trans person for the evening. I thank you, Richard. Thanks very much. I feel very honoured to be here, and there's a lot of remarkable work coming out of this institution, and I think that had I had the chance to study museum studies in the way that you have today, that it would have let me start all of this kind of work a lot earlier. So thanks very much for having me, Richard. I would like to talk to you about bigger issues and include them in this conversation about whether or not museums can affect social change. I want to think about whether they can move from a space of aesthetics, art for art's sake, enlightenment, a place that's about things, to a space that stands up for things, a space with agency, a space with an agenda whose aim is not for enlightenment but to enlighten. And I would argue this evening that yes, they can do this if they choose to. They can either choose to perpetuate role engulfment, and I'll talk more about this term, or they can combat it. They can foster or tackle social othering. And I'm going to rely heavily on quotes this evening that have come back from our visitor feedback. We've got thousands and thousands of them, unprecedented numbers coming through the museum, new audiences, younger audiences, diverse audiences, the impact of the exhibition at Brighton Museum and Art Gallery, where it's now been extended for its 3rd year until the end of 2019, has been unfathomable. No one expected it. I am more aware and hence understanding, as a cis queer male, it never ceases to amaze me how much I can and have to learn about trans people's lives and experiences. Eye-opening to what some people go through, and that more acceptance and allowing people to be who they are is needed. So I believe museums can foster social change, and this is evidence of it. I believe that they can proactively collect artefacts that can be used to unpack preconceived misconceptions about people who are under attack by the media, for example, or they can neglect to collect them as a form of historical genocide. They can remain silent, or they can speak out. Eye-opening and happy for me as my trans friends to be getting more recognition. It's not censored, which is good, because we're tired of being censored. Before I go on too much further, a couple of key texts that I rely on when I'm doing my thinking. Susan Ferrantino's Interpreting LGBT History at Museums and Historic Sites. You just can't live without Eileen Hooper Greenhill, anything that they write, anything. Museum Revolutions, How Museums Change and Are Changed, a collection. Kevin Moore, Museums and Popular Culture. And of course, Richard Sandel and Nightingale, Museums, Equality and Social Justice, central to my work. So let me tell you a little bit about the collection itself. It began by collecting everyday objects and stories from Brighton's trans community. It's not really the Museum of Transology, it's the Museum of the Privileged South East Transology, and I can talk more about that when we get going in question time. It now includes over 250 objects chosen by over 120 trans people to represent their gender identities. It's the largest of its kind in the world. The collection is as complex as the trans experience itself, with objects of social history, dress and textiles, medicine, beauty products, personal ephemera, human remains, paper, art, very, very difficult to conserve because it's extraordinarily complex with its materials. But it is united by themes of hope, despair, desire, ambition, and confidence. Each object comes with a metaphoric tag attached to it, displaying a handwritten explanation of its significance to the donor's gender journey, making the ordinary objects extraordinary. Brought together, the individual experiences provide a revelatory account of how gender politics is evolving in the UK, as well as the increasing shift in social consciousness, if not towards mainstream acceptance of trans people in the UK, at least gradually towards legislative equality. I intentionally wanted to create a socially responsible museum, from recycling found objects that were used to create our set to make less of an eco-footprint, to accessibility, to display methodologies. I wanted the Museum of Transology to be an exercise in good practice in every way, not just trans inclusivity. And I intended for it to be robust because I knew the kind of scrutiny it would come under. It was not going to just go unnoticed. And in his article, Museum, Social Responsibility and the Future We Desire, the author Robert James makes a link between the forces of capitalism and the measuring of a museum's worth and success in terms of market forces that breed spectaculars and shows as a form of dazzling entertainment. and contrast this with the social responsibility of museums that should aim to be more inclusive and help to build stronger communities. He suggests that museums ought to be concerned with the management of the hierarchy of wisdom, going beyond labelling and education to incorporating the moral, social and practical dimensions of solving life problems in an expert fashion, making the moral, social and practical legacies of human society both visible and accessible. Broadly speaking, he says, being socially responsible can mean facilitating civic engagement, acting as an agent of social change, or moderating sensitive social issues. So let me go through with you the aims of the Museum of Transology: to tackle the misunderstanding and marginalisation of trans people that results in profound levels of discrimination, violence and inequality; to redress the neglect of trans history and narratives within the museum and heritage sector; to encourage trans people, hard to reach apparently, I'd suggest that they haven't been reached, their family and friends into the museum by increasing its relevance to their lives; to build sustainable partnerships and collaborations with LGBTIQ communities; to provide volunteer training to trans people, diversifying the museum and heritage sector at large. And we've had numerous volunteers train with us who are now proactively working within the museum at Brighton Museum, and they've been spotting narratives in existing collections like the toy collection that have been overlooked previously because they're looking through a different gender lens; to engage audiences with new and modern debates surrounding gender and identity, and to allow trans people to tell their own stories as a way of challenging the media spectacularisation of our lives. Hi.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've heard LGBTQ. I haven't heard the I before.
Intersex. And it's really, thank you for asking. The I has been erased from LGBTQ. Intersex people are not trans. We are categorised and put in the same category. The museum includes objects that are intersex and represent intersex lives, because our policy was to collect every object that was given to us. I'm going to talk a bit more about the collecting, but I would suggest to you that there is an absolute dearth of misunderstanding surrounding this community and information, and that the LGBTQ community is equally as responsible for that erasure, and it needs addressing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Thank you for asking. Please, anyone who does want to interrupt and ask, really open to that. Okay, so the author, Robert James, who I was talking about, goes on to suggest that the values of a socially responsible museum include idealism, intimacy, depth and interconnectedness. Well, the Museum of Transology is unapologetically idealistic. If idealism is defined as thinking about things and the way that they could be, and then taking action rather than accepting the way that they are. And at the heart of this idealism is striving for constant improvement of the human condition. It hasn't always gone down well, that approach, but I figure this quote means that I've done my job. I explained why in a recent comment piece I wrote for the Museums Association Journal, and I'll say it again and again and again. To not see yourself on the walls of a museum is to be rendered historically homeless. It is to be told that your life is not worth remembering and that you are destined to be forgotten. Literally. Because the trans tipping point that's been going on for about 15 years is tipping trans people over the edge, right? So I lost 3 friends to suicide last year. Chrissy Bentley, very close to me. This is, I get a bit upset. This is her ID. She was in the military. It's her ID when she was identified as Chris, and her ID as Chrissy, and she gave not only her IDs, but also her hat that was her boy hat, and said, well, I don't need it anymore, do I? But then had a really nice comment about, I do actually prefer it though. So it sort of unpacks very gently that, you know, this myth surrounding trans people striving to reinforce gender stereotypes. She liked her boys hat more. That's not why she was doing it. She won't be forgotten because she's part of a collection now. And this is the significance of collecting, right? I'm going to quote you, Richard, and I hope you don't mind. There are now increasingly bold and explicit claims, says Richard Sandel, that are beginning to explore the museum's impact on the lives of individuals and communities and the role that cultural organisations are playing in tackling specific manifestations of inequality, such as racism and other forms of discrimination, poor health, crime, unemployment. So to investigate how this applies to the trans community, I'm going to quickly run through the trans report, Stonewalls trans report that was released last year, done by YouGov. 1 in 8, and this unpacks what life is like for trans people in the UK, okay? 1 in 8 trans employees have been physically and attacked by a colleague or customer in the last year. Half of trans people have hidden their identity at work for fear of discrimination. A quarter of trans people have experienced homelessness. 2 in 5 trans people would like to undergo medical intervention, but haven't because they fear the consequences it'll have on their family life. Almost half don't feel comfortable using the toilet. A third of trans people have been discriminated against in a cafe, restaurant, bar in the last year. More than a quarter of trans people in a relationship in the last year face domestic abuse. More than 2 in 5 trans people avoid certain streets because they don't feel safe there. 1 in 4 were discriminated against when looking for a house or flat to rent or buy. And when accessing general healthcare services, 2 in 5 trans people said healthcare staff lacked understanding of trans health needs. I was told about a week ago by someone looking at my digestive system that after they asked why I was taking testosterone, I was told that my chest surgery was causing the problems. More than a third of trans students in higher education have experienced negative comments from staff. So, I would argue that increased visibility is increasing vulnerability. The trans tipping point's just the tip of the iceberg. Such a widespread campaign of hate against members of the LGBTIQ community has not been seen since the AIDS crisis or the introduction of Section 28. Museums must fight back because exclusion from the museum reflects exclusion from society. Hidden history is a form of othering. According to Anne Lawrence in Women in England, 1500-1760, A Social History, and I quote, "The term hidden history is used when the history of a hitherto neglected group begins to appear, as in, for example, in the case of black history, women's history, lesbian and gay history. The phrase is not simply used to describe the group's emergence into mainstream history. It also has an explicit message that these groups have lacked history because society has been unwilling to see them as separate groups with particular rights. Groups hidden from history are hidden for 3 reasons. They're hidden because of prejudices against the group in the past, because of modern prejudices, and because of the absence of records." Now, I personally would like to make a bit of a proactive call to stop using the term hidden histories. We are not children playing hide and seek. We're not giggling in the dark corners of life, just waiting for the cis gays to throw a spotlight on us. I would suggest that this is censored history. There's nothing hidden, it's been cut out. Ending the censorship of people's stories from museum narratives can empower the communities they reflect by directly combating what Scaff and Perlin refer to as role engulfment. The term role engulfment is usually used for when one is chronically sick or disabled, when these conditions might increasingly constrict one's personal identity or opportunities for social participation. For those trans people experiencing role engulfment, a life where everything revolves around how hard it is to exist being trans, any opportunity to reinforce previously valued roles that have been lost, hope for them has been lost, or to offer new valued roles even temporarily, might provide individuals with a therapeutic means to impact on their sense of self and connection to others. Museums can do this. They can offer hope. They can show trans people that they have the potential to find love, a life partner, and have children. This highlights the way in which museums can have a positive impact on people's mental health. According to Lois Silverman in her article, The Therapeutic Potential of Museums as Pathways to Inclusion, and I quote, "Time spent in a museum can yield a number of outcomes for visitors. While studies show that some visitors may seek and experience relaxation, social bonding, self-identity, self-esteem, and other outcomes from their museum experience, it's relatively rare that museums choose to focus explicitly on facilitating outcomes other than cognitive gain. Yet therapeutic outcomes can and often do occur in museums. The world of mental health can remind museums of the range of goals that are essential for a healthy society." So, objects make history. We all know that. Without objects, in 100 years' time, we'd be left again to rely largely on the media that spectacularizes us, or the medical institutions that pathologize us to explain to us what life was like as a trans person. And this has been going on for hundreds of years. So this is a particularly interesting example. It's an example of the new development of scientific illustrations that used text to explain what they were. It was the addition of the placement of identifying letters amid the trappings of luxury and conventions of Rococo portraiture, be it erotic or otherwise, that signalled to 18th century viewers the intermediate space that this type of illustration occupied between scientific and popular or pornographic imagery. So the deep public examination of trans people and the right to examine them and their bodies was actually facilitated by this new wave of illustration in the 1750s. The printing technology was behind it. So we can possibly think about this being one of those points in history where it became okay to study trans people and to make them subjects rather than myth and mythology, a matter of fact that we ought to examine. A century later, it's still happening, so this is 1833. Interesting, well, pertinent, that this was in the Sussex Advertiser, so Sussex being where the collection was built and where the Museum of Transology is now on show. And it outlines the case of Eliza Edwards, who didn't have anyone claim her body when she died. So she was taken to Guy's Hospital for dissection, and it was a public dissection. That was medical practice of the day, where you'd have a room full of scientists and medical professionals looking at the body. They undressed her, and the deceased was declared to be, in the words of the article, a perfect man. The quote says, "The jury room was crowded to excess, and after they were sworn in, they proceeded to view and discuss the body." And yet, nearly 2 centuries later, even when this spectacular moment in Western gender history neatly and conveniently coincided with the 50-year anniversary of partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, still, I saw that there was scant evidence of museums collecting the material culture to evidence trans lives through their own lenses. Essentially, this moment in trans history was threatening to slip into the historical abyss once again. We were going to be faced in the same situation in 100 years' time at just looking at the medical records and what the newspapers said about us. Museums weren't collecting. And so that was my motivation, to ensure that from at least this day on, the academic justification of the ongoing erasure of trans lives could be put to a halt. In the words of Howard Zinn, and I'm sure quite a few of you will be familiar with this, Archives are biased towards the important and powerful people in society, tending to ignore the impotent and obscure. We learn most about the rich, not the poor, the politically active, not the politically alienated, men, not women, white, not black, free people rather than prisoners, civilians rather than soldiers, officers rather than enlisted men. I would advocate that we learn about the heterosexual, not the homosexual, the cisgendered, not the trans. His overriding point is that leveraging the power of the archive is not the politicisation of an inevitably neutral craft, but the humanising of an inevitably political craft. And I would suggest that we're not victims and unrepresented in history, that we have to take that passively. I say that we can act proactively by collecting our own stories. This is curation as a form of activism. To not collect this moment in trans time would have been to let it slip into the historical abyss. It's therefore significant that despite the Museum of Transology collection only being 4 years old, the collection itself includes objects that are significantly older. So just as I had been saving my own artefacts as material markers of my gender milestones, upon embarking on the collecting process, I swiftly discovered a vibrant, undocumented, widespread culture of collecting already existed in the trans community. Upon reflection, it's perhaps unsurprising. When one considers the extraordinariness of the trans experience, the deep personal reflection and the determination fundamental to the process of declaring oneself trans, anyone who's queer and has come out will understand what I'm talking about. It's no wonder that trans people became passionate about the possessions that record their process of becoming. You can ignore us in the museum, but you can't stop us recording our transcestry. Trans people may not have been appearing in museum narratives, but we had nonetheless been saving our own stories, proactively redressing the neglect of trans history outside the academy. We were already the curators of our memories, already the collectors of our evidence, already material culturalists converting the daily ephemeral into the perennial. This one, I'm giving up my blue earring. It's very special to me as I've worn it in Brighton for Trans Pride, the first one ever, which is a great deal for me. This earring doesn't even have a back on it. It's not even silver. It would have been £2 from Claire's, right? The kid has kept it safely in the drawer for 6 years, right? And, you know, young person, trans, homelessness, moving house, not necessarily a place where you have all your things ordered in drawers really neatly, right? It's an absolute proactive attempt to collect this material marker of their trans life. In 1968, Jean Baudrillard summarised this exact phenomenon of saving our own transcestry when he stated that, and I quote, "The whole miracle of collecting is that it is invariably oneself that one collects." Trans artist Simon Koff concurs when he says about his jacket, "Suited is made from packaging of about 4 years of my personal use of testosterone." Baudrillard extends his ideas stating that the unique object epitomises the set to which it belongs. So it is that this single, first ever vial of testosterone, all the objects were coming to my house, and I just have a standard letterbox, so when they were too big to go through the door, I had to get a red letter and go up to the post office and go, "Hi, I'm that trans guy again, what you got for me?" Right? And so I had this, it was obviously big enough that I had to go and get this, it wouldn't fit through my letterbox. So I went up and there was this box. It was completely covered in sellotape. And oh my God, this is so exciting. So undoing the box, cutting it open with my pocket knife. Okay, inside. Oh right, okay. It's got those, what I now know are called foam peanuts. Okay, peanut. What? Down to one box of hormones. Open up the box. It's this one. And this kid's written this letter about the fact that it's his first ever vial of testosterone that he's kept. And it's so extraordinary, it was so precious to him that he's sent along this thing like this. So when we put it on display in the museum, I've kept the box and I've kept the peanuts and we put it just right in the front of it. It's interesting because this then goes to a collection like this. that then goes on to need its own cabinet. And when you unpack what they say, finally in the first term of my second year at uni, the consultants gave me the go-ahead. I was so happy. I had to self-medicate as I felt desperate, but it became too expensive. So we're dealing with all different types of issues here, right? I've always been confused as to why so people are adamant that I should be allowed them. So we've gone from gatekeeping, medication, to discrimination. I was surprised that they actually found me very emotionally unstable and really depressed for the first time in my life. Use and the consequences. The best thing that's happened to me apart from my wife, so we're back to this quote. What's interesting is that if a curator who was not trans had curated that collection and were bringing in objects from outside to represent the trans experience, they would have put, I've no doubt, a box of hormones on display and said, some people take testosterone. And that would have been it. The complexity of the narrative has come from the voices that are behind the objects. According to Hooper Greenhill, in the past, the curator's role was as object expert. Now in exhibition making, the project leader is often not the curator, but the exhibition team project manager. In the past, the knowledge of the object was the most important thing required to make an exhibition. Now, knowledge about the audience is equally important. I would add that the object expert is the person who used it, with use trumping manufacture, consumption trumping production. In Collecting in a Consumer Society, Russell Belk outlines the relationship between the development of consumer society and the rise of collecting by individuals and institutions. So today, in an age where capitalism has progressed across 2 centuries, from the Industrial Revolution that turned nature into a commodity, into now where the capitalist digital sphere commodifies our emotions and our imaginations, the curator is increasingly seeing their role as the facilitator between the user and the object, drawing meaning from the humanization of the commodity, an exact reversal of the digital capitalism where our previously intangible feelings are now tracked, bought, sold and traded for profit. And it's incredibly interesting. The publicly funded museum must increasingly become open to being curated by the public. This singular curatorial voice, drawn from chronically non-diverse heritage workforce, must be decentralised, replaced by a plurality of voices, perspectives and expertise. This is a more widely democratic curatorial approach and will be the backbone of socially responsible museums that recognise once and for all that they have social agency, and consequently a responsibility to act upon rebalancing the perpetuation of misinformation that manifests in an attack on human rights. The age of the passive visitor has passed. Audiences want to be involved actively in exhibition making. Audiences bring with them agendas and knowledges. The Museum of Transology has over 120 curators. They are the object experts. They chose the material for the show. And it's precisely for this reason that the Museum of Transology's collecting policy was to accept and display everything that was offered by a person who identified as trans. It was intended to empower the donors to tell the stories that mattered to them, unedited. In turn, this built trust amongst the community in the integrity of the project. It also desisted the idea that there is a hierarchy of preciousness amongst the objects that reflect trans lives, and it resisted class-based assumptions embedded in the traditional approach to collecting the very best in art and design. Collecting everyday objects was a deliberate strategy employed to demystify trans lives. The power of everyday objects lies in the ability they have to build a relationship between the subject and the viewer. The familiarity of the objects on display and the part they play in most people's everyday lives combats the misrepresentation and othering of trans lives and bodies by their sheer relatability. Everyone owns a t-shirt with a slogan on it. Everyone owns a lipstick that's been kicking around in the bottom of a handbag that's from Boots. It's not even on, right? Every teenager thinks the clothes that their mum chooses for them is tragic. These objects are mundane. They're human. They're normal. They're routine. Guess what? So are trans people. The donor of this links Everyday Can explains its significance. This was the first boy product I bought. It was for a drag king night, and it was such a life-changing event. It felt so good dressing as a boy and break down some invisible barrier I had against boy stuff, opening doors, smelling great, and they've drawn a little strong arm next to it. And it just goes to show that that this is not an object that's about transness, this is an object about growing up, because every young guy going through puberty for some reason thinks that Lynx is a sign of manhood and smells good, right? If a museum is a classifying house that constructs rationality, then the introduction of objects with their stories attached to them can deconstruct irrational classifications or counteract exclusion from categorisation altogether. As Foucault posits, there is a possibility of recategorisation if we recognise that we look through a lens of rationality that is particular to our time and culture, that we can, and to quote, break up all the ordered surfaces and all the planes with which we are accustomed to tame the wild profusion of existing things and collapse and threaten our age-old distinction between the same and the other. My first pair of ballet shoes is a terrific example of what Foucault is talking about. I've been doing ballet since I was 4 years old. When I came out, I was worried that people wouldn't see me as male because of my love of ballet and point, but because I love it so much, I refused to quit. Since coming out, I've been more confident in my dancing, and while they were worn long before my transition, they hold a lot of meaning for me, as ballet's made me the man that I am. They've questioned their own gender identity, broken it up, down, and used this object to explain it. Foucault goes on, I guess, he uses this example of, and he calls it a certain Chinese encyclopedia, and inside the encyclopedia it categorises different animals in a way that's foreign to us and what we would think of when we go to a natural history museum. But because, the point he's making is that because there were obviously valid categorisations at the time, the reality of the category shows that our categories can equally be as framed by our time and our place, historically, geographically, and through a social lens. And so this could threaten how we categorise things within museums at all. If we were to go back to what this Chinese encyclopedia said, we'd have to rewrite all the text panels in the Natural History Museum. And I think that this is why the trans movement is so fundamentally important to the UK's own social history. It's challenging our preconceived notions of what's male and what's female, and fundamentally suggests that these categories are constructions. How would we have to recategorise in museums to reflect this? How can we open up new ways of reading gender in museums? How many text panels would we have to rewrite? This is complicated by the idea that if the aim of museums is to conserve and protect and show things how they remain the same, then how can they be spaces that understand change? In so many ways they don't and they can't, but this doesn't mean that they couldn't. So I jump forward to James Barrie. Trans people wanting curators to acknowledge their recognition of gender non-conforming behaviour are often quite patronisingly accused of amateurishly employing ahistoricism. We can't call trans because the word didn't exist back then. Dr. James Barrie, who studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh from 1809 to 1812, and from there went on to have a distinguished career as an army surgeon in Cape Town in South Africa, the island of St. Helena, Trinidad and Tobago, ending his career as an Inspector General of Military Hospitals, is described on Edinburgh University's website, and I quote, as having a squeaky voice. That was eventually explained when his maid laid out his body on his death against his wishes, and I quote Edinburgh University's website, and because Barrie was a woman. To be fair, it's not only Edinburgh Uni making this statement. Barrie has just been included in the Royal College of Physicians exhibition open now, Women in Medicine. So I ask how we are meant to read the past if we can't acknowledge that we do it through the lens of the present. Foucault challenges the very idea that reason and truth are absolute concepts and proposes instead that they are historical, social and cultural constructs. Museums can't afford to be stuck in the past if they are to play a role today in fostering greater social cohesion through engagement and education. I would advocate that this contemporary collection of functional used objects is both political and post-colonial because it was made by the people for the people with the people's consent. Its use of display as an effective means of articulating values at a time of change, with the past values embedded in the authority of the institutionalized space being reconciled with today's experiences of gender that are being inserted into it. A use of collecting and curating as a form of direct activism, of non-violent resistance. I would like to call it collectivism. Collectivism curation suggests that museology can contribute to the repertoire of contention, queering museological practice through process. Like I say, it's a continuation of the LGBTI activist struggle. I'd like to end with an anecdote about, I really think it exemplifies the role, why it's important to have this exhibition in a museum and not as a pop-up display. It was actually, it began its life in lots of different ways. It's a long story and I can go into it later on, but essentially, to cut a long story short, it moved from the London College of Fashion Space Gallery where it got its initial funding. And it moved into the Brighton Museum and Art Gallery, and I spent a long time when it first moved in debating hotly with the more conservative curators and conservationists in the museum about, I insisted on still having the objects on open display. I was passionate about it because I felt that to put it all behind glass created a barrier to look at yourself, looking in your own reflection, looking through the glass, through yourself onto the object, was creating another level of spectacularization. That's exactly what I wanted to take out. I wanted them to still remain everyday objects by feeling everyday and not glorified behind glass. And not least because the set here, and this, our Tranigan, we like to call it, was built in community making workshops where the community came together and talked and crafted and made to break down the barriers of communication and to place ownership on the set itself. And of course, on the evening of the opening, we had 250 tickets available on opening night. They were all booked out, 243 people turned up, and all night, over and over and over again, I had people coming up to me who had things in the exhibition going, oh my God, it's so amazing to see it behind glass, it's like a real exhibition. And I just realised this is the power of museums, yeah? It validates the stories and the objects. One last tag. Thank you for this exhibit. I feel connected, I feel emotional, I feel loved, and I feel, dare I say, valid. Thank you. I needed to see this. I'm proud to call this my community. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much for that amazing...
It's a bit of a whirlwind, sorry.
It is a whirlwind, but really incredible to hear the story of the museum and the tremendous thinking that's gone behind it. I was saying to EJ earlier, I thought that the project could only really have been created by somebody who is both, in some senses, insider and outsider. EJ is... works on a whole range of curatorial and cultural projects, and I think your deep knowledge of the museum as an institution, what it can do, what its limitations, what its problems, its drawbacks, its possibilities are, it completely infuses that whole project and makes it incredibly powerful. And I was also saying, I thought beyond the subject matter of trans lives, it's also a remarkable example which I use with students to think just more generally about what museums can do, their social agency, as you said, and their social opportunities and responsibilities. So really instructive and inspiring. Thank you. We've got chance for some questions. We have a roving mic. I'd ask you to use that if possible, so we can everyone can hear. Who would like to start us off? Do you have some questions or comments? We've got Jenny here.
Hiya, thank you. That was absolutely amazing and really interesting to hear. I just wondered what your plans were for kind of the future of this. Are you going to continue with the project, and if so, what kind of form do you see that taking? Thank you.
It's a really thank you for asking. It's a really complex question, because I talked a little bit about wanting this exhibition to be an example of good practice at large, and so one of the outcomes that I want from it is for it to be able to tour to other communities around the UK as a start, for those communities to see the level of finish on it and the professionalism of it, so it doesn't feel like a cabinet down at the Marlborough pub that it originally was, and so that can act as inspiration. But what I wanted to do was take the text panels, take the logos, take the training engagement program that we have around it with us to share those resources. As Richard said, this project actually wouldn't have happened had I not had knowledge of working within a museum. The museum didn't do the community engagement, I did, right? So what I want to do is bring all those resources with me and leave them with those communities so that we can collect on the spot, and then leave museums of transology everywhere, so there can be loads of them, and then this will bring an interconnectivity of history making between trans communities. So that side of the answer would be, well then I need to tour it. But the collection's been on display for 4 years now. It's fragile. There's, I know already, there's damage being done to it. There's no money. On the other hand, no museum has actually come forward and said that they want to take the collection permanently and house it. So I haven't had any offers. The Wellcome Institute has made noises, but I'm loath to pathologise the collection, so I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that sits right home. So the answer is I don't know. I really need to work it out really soon.
I actually want to follow on that question. If not the collection moving to other institutions or being hosted, which I hope will happen, have you ever done events with other museums or staff? Because it made me think that not just the objects, but actually the research you've done would be so beneficial to other institutions. I work with human remains, for example, and so I was really interested in when you talked about gender, because that's not really a conversation that's happening with collections that have, human remains that can be really old, because, as you said, we look at them through the present. So I have worked a lot with archaeological human remains, and we look at them as archaeological human remains and really impose those sort of binary, genders.
It's a very interesting area, because archaeological remains would say that I'm a woman in 100 years' time, right? So it's really tricky. You erase identity. I have done some interaction, so the collection actually started with my own things, but from there becoming public, I worked on a project called Brighton Transformed. We did interventive curation throughout Brighton as one of those interventive curations. It was an oral history project where we trained trans people in the Oral History Society standards to record other trans people's voices, so that it was trans people talking to trans people and they didn't have to transplain the whole lines away before they started the interview, right? So amazing things came out of that, and then we did interventions out of that collection around town. One of the things I did was ask people who were involved in that project to give me an object of theirs. We had no money, so I got a little second-hand Art Deco cabinet, and it even had a broken glass door on it, and put fairy lights in it. Well, we put it in the queer pub in town over Pride and Trans Pride. You couldn't get to the bar, because so many people were stuck around it the whole time. I was like, oh, light bulb. So it's grown from there, and so the next step for me was to buy a flat-packed glass case from IKEA and go around and take my Museum of Transology and put it places. So I did that with, I've done that with a couple of institutions, and then I do a lot of talking. I talk all the time. But what I really think is that museums should, I'm quite astounded that more museums haven't been in contact proactively. This model can be rolled out everywhere. It has the trust of communities, it has the public profile. It's still a scary subject, I think.
Can I ask another one? Just
Go
so we've got the mic. What about other countries? Have you heard, do you know if there's similar conversations? I'm French and I've not heard of similar things.
I've got a very good friend doing Queering the Museum for their PhD in France, but no, I think that, if I'm to be honest with you, I think that the UK does some of the most progressive and brave curation in the world. And no, I haven't talked yet. I think we're getting onto a really, an important point here, and it's that community collection relies on the community. I am one person. This has nearly killed me. I have 5 other jobs, So this is the weak point. Without the infrastructure behind these projects and the support, where do you find the time to sit down and write huge grant applications? Travelling from here to there to everywhere to speak, etc. All of this, not earning any money. And so this is fundamentally where museums have to get behind and go, actually, there's some investment required.
Thank you.
God knows they've benefited from the exhibition. Thousands and thousands and thousands of visitors from new audiences,
Me again.
Hi.
So I actually asked a very similar question to Richard this morning. We were talking about the National Trust projects and Prejudice and Pride, and how different trust foundation sites had changed the narrative and the way that they interpreted it to include more gay and lesbian narratives. And I was wondering if you know anything about starting to do that, including the trans narrative within just regular, I don't want to say regular, that's awful, I apologize, but including that within the narrative of the museum.
Do I know of any other projects doing it? I wrote the Prejudice and Pride podcast series and co-presented with Claire Boulding, so I was happy to get trans narratives into that. I have curated Queer and Now for Tate Britain, and that was an opportunity for me to, massive program. That was an opportunity to bring trans voices and performers into that space. Interesting anecdote, there were about over 100 performers and speakers come through the door for the one-day festival. On the programme, it was broken down into about 30 workshops and performances across the day. The one critical email I got from the general public was from a person who identified as a lesbian, and they said to me, why is there so much trans stuff and not enough lesbian stuff? And I had to really unpack it, and I went through the programme, and after a lot of thinking, it occurred to me what actually had happened, because I had to sit down and go, this person's a lesbian, this person's a lesbian, and there were more lesbians than trans people in the programme, as it turned out. But I realised that trans people who were performing or speaking were putting trans in their titles. They were calling themselves trans, and I went into the V&A. I'm a dress historian by trade, so always back to my dress collections. And I went into the V&A and looked at their LGBT collection of protest t-shirts. And of course in the 80s, lesbian, dykey, with a big tick, the Nike tick, That's where those communities were. They used to label themselves as out and proud. So that's where the trans thing's coming from now. It was overwhelmed. Whereas the lesbian performers were going, I'm doing a workshop on intimacy, you know, and movement, etc. They weren't saying a lesbian workshop on lesbian movement. I think the trans voices are starting to come out in different projects around the country, and you know, you've mentioned a couple of really good ones. What I don't see is collecting, and that's what I feel so passionate about, because we will literally be left with the Daily Mirror again, right? And that for me is where museums are letting us down, because this collection halts the erasure of trans history. We're not allowed to call Gluck trans, okay? You know, we're not allowed to, for some reason people think that by saying trans erases lesbian. There's more than one word in the world, you know, co-narratives, they don't cancel each other out. There's different ways of looking at things. History is not linear. You know, it's why we can't have joint conversations, I don't know. But I think that this collection stops that from ever happening again and goes, right, from here on in at least, here's some trans objects, right? And here's people, and here's their voices, and here's their experiences. Without them, we are relying on the media and transphobic voices to narrate backwards again. It could happen so easily.
Can I ask a question?
I'll get off my high horse.
In some of the, so all the labels are written by the donors, or the curators, as you said. They're kind of people who gave the objects. Some of them, and I noticed this when I came to see it at its first iteration in London. There was humour was threaded throughout, and been kind of exploring with students a little bit recently different creative strategies for moving audiences some way towards our shared goals in some way. And I wondered if the use of humour was purposeful, or how you see what role that can play in that broader project that you've shared.
One of the criticisms that I've had from the trans community has been that the show's too negative. And so I think, you know, I didn't write the show, that's how the community feels about itself. But there's these glorious moments. You know, there's a t-shirt done by young people of the All Sorts Youth Project, and they've all drawn on the back, and one of them goes, "Fuck the system," you know. And so there's this sort of energy that comes through that reflects a vibrancy, a confidence, a new wave of hope. I wonder how much people who were writing their labels, how aware they were of that, whether they themselves were using that as a strategy to combat all the negativity. I think there's real moments of hope in there, and that humour is a very big part of that. It in a way it humanises, doesn't it? You know, but it also it puts a bit of a cap on the catastrophisation of trans lives as well. And I don't mean to always be going, you know, by doing that Stonewall report by saying it's all shit. I mean, it is. But on the other side, you know, we have a Museum of Transology. Who would have thought that it would ever happen? Do you know what I mean? In a museum. So there is a social shift happening, and I think that humour and positivity that traditionally probably was attached to the drag community, and this idea of performativity and cynicism and irony that has been used to often unpack gender stereotypes. I mean, the drag community's come under a lot of attention for being sexist. I think we're seeing sort of a bit of a shift away from that, but there's still exciting new things happening, that are fun and exploratory.
One more here, and then I think one at the back.
I was just wondering how, because obviously throughout history, like the trans identity has been sort of censored, as you were saying. How, as like cis members of the community, can we help uplift and prevent that from happening again? How can we lend our voices to like help stop that?
You write nice comments when you visit the Museum of Transology. I think that familiarising yourself with terminology is a really good start, using people's correct pronouns. Understanding that this is not a trans battle, this is a gender equality battle, and that these are, a fight for all of us. Understanding that this is part of the feminist movement, it's the most significant wave of feminism since second wave feminism in the 70s. We are fighting to not be defined by our genitalia and not have our behaviours attached to our genitalia. Isn't that the core of feminism? Supporting your friends, understanding that there's a place for education within schools and institutions for these conversations, demanding that our museums address representation, and working in the sector with those ethics behind you and embedded into your practice. You guys are the future of the museum sector. I think that we absolutely, the heritage sector has a lot to answer for. Chronically misrepresented. It is not diverse. It is abysmally underpaid, which is why people tend to be from privileged backgrounds to be able to do the work anyway, right? So there's much bigger conversations here. I'm not sure that it's just a cis supporting the trans. I think these are social issues.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking. Very nice.
Did I see any more hands at the back? Any more questions? Yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering, you were talking about earlier these older, stories where you were talking about how people were represented, women being called men and vice versa. I was just wondering how you see this going forward for museums who have older collections, i.e. not collecting contemporary art, for instance. Do you have suggestions as to how to bring this into that space?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's a really important question. One of the aims of future reiterations of this exhibition is that I had always intended for it to engage with existing collections, not to be standalone as just this moment and time, but to go from here we can bounce back and think about this object, this item of dress, etc., etc. So very interesting example. What you're talking about is the Gluck collection, and there was an exhibition Gluck recently at Brighton Museum and Art Gallery. The trans and gender non-conforming and non-binary communities all spoke up because the exhibition was going to have the word lesbian in the title. I would argue quite rightly, but it's not the only word to put in the title. So what I would suggest is that there is absolutely room for co-narratives, right? That by bringing in people from today's communities to talk about what objects mean to them as a way of destabilising the hierarchy of expertise that is only the historian knows about this and can talk about this. Well, actually, that object looks pretty bloody queer to me, and I say it is because I'm queer and that's how it feels, right? Is enough. So I think that community voices and voices outside of the historic elite, including them, is really valid. I think that there is room for co-narratives. I don't see why there wasn't a text panel going, Gluck was gender non-conforming and had lovers who were women, right? That you can have a trans text panel next to a lesbian text panel. They don't cancel each other out. What happened was that the curators took out the word lesbian, took out the word lesbian from the entire exhibition, took out all the pronouns, took everything out. So they didn't just erase trans history, they erased lesbian history at the one and the same time. Yeah, because they were just so scared of upsetting people. It wasn't mean or it was fear. They didn't want to get it wrong. I think that it's all about letting people who aren't experts in to talk about their personal relationships and to find and identify their own place within our collections. There is no reason to use the word trans retrospectively if that word didn't exist, but we can identify gender nonconformity. We can recognise lives lived. We can stop placing our perceptions of their bodies in the modern context. And I mean, Dr. Barrie practiced as a medical man, you know, that was the term back then, for over 50 years internationally. And he's in the Women in Medicine exhibition. You know, we need more than one voice. I come back to this point that I think the future of curation is that curators should be facilitators, right? That they shouldn't just have the all-knowing voice of authority. It doesn't exist.
So working for curators to be able to reach out, work with, respect the lived experience of trans people as expertise to help them through some of those seemingly difficult topics is a good way forward.
Yeah, and it's not just trans communities, it's black communities, brown communities, communities with different abilities, cultural background. Like, this is about opening and stop this like cis white hetero narrative of expertise that comes from elite backgrounds of collecting the very finest in art and design.
What I really love about your Gluck and other examples are that there's no one right way to do this, but to engage, think, ask a variety of communities and take some input there.
It's also more interesting. You know, at the end of the day, it makes better exhibitions. They're more tangible. They have more resonance. The narrative is much more intimate. You know, I think people are starting to demand more of museums. Everyone's bored of going in and reading a fixed text panel. They go, what? Right? It doesn't talk to me. I saw a kid go into the museum the other day and stand at the text panel and try and swipe it. You know, like, technology is changing, how we absorb information is changing, we live in a digital sphere. These fixed exhibitions that are linear are no longer enough. They're not modern, they're outdated. You know, I think that you can get the voice you want just by going online. So to think that that stops when you go into a museum is to ignore how people get information now as well.
Question here. Just get the microphone for you.
So, talking about the way that people interact with museums today and this digital sphere of the internet, what is the online presence of the museum like? Are you guys very active, or is there like a page of a constantly changing narrative?
It takes people to run it. Social media is a beast that needs feeding. You need social media teams. So we do have an online presence. We have some of the objects, and what these tags are the most dynamic part of the collection because they're growing. So I have about 3,000 of them at the moment. Last count we had 1,697 at Brighton Museum, and 17 of those were negative. So overwhelming, like those figures are just through the roof, right? So we're posting those. We were posting those at one stage when we had someone who wanted to do that. Again, it comes down to these ideas that this is a community project that has one person running it, essentially. I do have volunteer teams, but again, it takes time to chase people and remind people, and etc., etc. So there's the Instagram. Facebook posts something sometimes. The other thing is, and I was talking to Richard about this before, is that I'm vulnerable. So I would like to come across as confident and thick-skinned, but social media scares the living daylights out of me. There was a recent online campaign on Mumsnet against the Museum of Transology. They were threatening to come in and trash Brighton Museum. The LGBT Safety Forum contacted me and alerted me to this plethora of tweets and threats, and I mean the comments were apparently outrageous. I didn't go near it. So again, I have to have this barrier that the professional world of museums doesn't give me because I actually exist outside of it. So these are the weaknesses in the project. The fact that it's not really a museum exhibition because it doesn't have that infrastructure.
Can I ask about so that infrastructure? If you could wave a magic wand and have a huge amount of resource and infrastructure, would you choose to see the Museum of Transology in some unique space that's staffed by trans people and exists as a high-profile Museum of Transology, or would you like to see it equally well resourced but embedded within a city or a national museum?
It's 6 one half dozen the other, isn't it? But I think the project that needs talking about here is Queer Britain, and the attempt to start a national LGBT museum. The problem with that, and when we try and imagine what a queer museum looks like in the future, is that if we have a queer museum, every single institution that we've been working so hard to include queer people in around the country can all go, no, you guys do it. We don't need to do this now, right? You go over there and you do your gay stuff, yeah? We're really busy doing all the other communities we have to represent, and so it could take them off the hook, and in a way that others us, right? In actual fact, what I think should happen is that it should be on permanent display at Wright Museum because it was built there by that community. It has the largest LGBT population per capita in the UK, and it gives people a destination to go to, and over time, the reputation builds, right? And there's something to be said for longevity because it is busier now in the Museum of Transology than it has been in the last 3 years. It's getting busier. People are finding out about it and going, you know. We could then tour parts of it and run these collecting processes so there can be museums of transology in everywhere that it goes to, and people can then just go, here's my Museum of Transology pack. It has the object description forms, it has the accession forms, it has the logo, it has the community workshop plan for 1 hour's community engagement, it has the text panels if I just want to print them out for the moment, and I can just go and do it without having any resources or curatorial expertise. And we can just have all these mini museums of transology everywhere, but I think it needs a home, and for me, the home of collections is where they grow. That's where they should be. I mean, people, our debates surrounding repatriation would say the same thing from my point of view. They belong where the people own them.
So a sort of dedicated space and a clarion call to all sorts of museums and galleries and heritage institutions to also contribute to that broader tackling that erasure that you've highlighted.
Absolutely, and to share the resources, because our museum sector is strapped of resources. We don't need to do the work all over again 100 times over. You know, someone did ask about what are other museums doing. I do get phone calls, you know, can you run this workshop and stuff, but in reality, you don't need to start again, you know, and sharing resources makes us more efficient as a sector as well. If it works, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Seems a great moment to end on there. If you haven't seen the Museum of Transology, it's on at Brighton for some further time.
No, end of November.
And it's really, really worth seeing.
Come to
It's
Trans
incredibly
Pride.
good. So thank you, and please join me in thanking EJ for coming up today.
Thanks.